So I recently posted a video about color wheels, and in that video I took 3 primary colors, so red, yellow, blue, in that case ultramarine blue, cadmium-free yellow medium, and cadmium-free red medium. They're kind of the primary colors that I think of, like the traditional, like if you think of a blue, I always think of ultramarine blue, and so on. So in that video, I showed the colors that you can mix and, or at least a range of colors that you can mix out of those 3 colors, had that represented on a color wheel. So today in this video, I'm going to take that color wheel and the colors that you can mix using those 3 colors and put it into a painting. So it's really taking the theory and making it real. So I took a look at the color wheel to see what I can mix using these 3 colors. I could see some very dark greens and blues, and that inspired me to pull up a photo that I took on a hike last summer. It was in the Rocky Mountains in Canada and had a small river, a forest, and a mountain in the distance. And it was a great subject that would allow me to make use of the dark greens and blues that I can mix with the colors on this color wheel. And I'm painting on an 8x8 canvas panel, and I'm using 3 flat brushes. They're all from the Princeton Aspen line in sizes 4, 6, and 8. And I mostly use the 6 with the odd touch of the 4 for really small detailed areas. And I don't know that I actually ended up using the 8, but it's good for painting your ground. For this painting, I knew it would be primarily blue and green, so I started with a red ground. And this allows me to paint freely and let little glimpses of red peek through. In addition to cadmium-free yellow medium, cad-free red medium, and ultramarine blue, I'm also using titanium white so I can adjust the value of my colors. You can use cadmium versions of the red and yellow and get similar results. I just happen to use the cadmium-free versions that Liquitex has developed. I often start painting subjects in the foreground and then move towards the back. In this case, I've started with the rocks and the water. I'm going to do a dark layer of pretty much everything first. I've mixed a dark brown using a bit of each of my triad colors. To get brown, you want it warmer, so I want to make sure to use more yellow and red than blue. I try not to be too fussy with any of my brush strokes. The rocks don't have to be perfectly shaped. I just aim for ovalish shapes. Remember, we're doing just the dark underlayer right now. Just put a single color of dark brown down for the rocks. Now I start in the trees to the right. I want this layer to be very dark, so I add a bit of yellow to blue to make this a dark green blue. Add just a touch of red to make it a bit more neutralized and help make it darker, and I lay this paint down. Use the narrow side of your brush to create the tree trunks that rise up above the main part of the forest, and don't be too fussy about painting branches. Paint some of this very dark green for the trees on the left. Since these trees are further away, you won't have too many defined trees that stick out above the rest. I go back and forth between the different trees, adding a bit more height to the forest on the right. I also add a bit more yellow and paint on a slightly lighter green. The light is coming from the right, so I make sure to avoid adding much lighter green on the left of the trees, because that's where the shadow would be. I also use the slightly lighter green for the trees further back. Generally, things in the distance won't be quite as dark as those near to you. Now let's tackle the river. It's a dull green, but since I want to start with a darker layer, I mix a blue-green that's fairly dark, although not as dark as when I painted the dark layer of the trees. Add a touch of red to this as well to neutralize it. Make sure to not add too much or you'll end up with a purple river. I paint this mix on really quickly. Remember, leave little peaks of the red ground here and there, particularly around the rocks. You can also use this blue to trim down or reshape any rocks that might have been too big or oddly shaped. Next up is the mountain. Similar to the rocks, take a bit of each color, but this time use a little bit more blue to make your neutral mix gray instead of brown. If you find your mix is too brown, keep adding a little bit more blue until you have a nice gray. Now it's time for the sky. I mix a bit of ultramarine blue with quite a bit of white. The sky isn't an area that I'm planning on focusing on too much for this painting, so I add a generous layer because I won't be adding a second layer. In the area around the tree limbs, I lay down loose and confident brush strokes, leaving plenty of pops of red around the tree limbs I painted in green. The brush strokes for the sky help shape branches on the tallest trees too. Let this layer completely dry, and I used a hairdryer to speed up the process. Now you can start on the final layers of the painting, which will mostly be lighter values. I'm using a stay wet palette, so my paint mixes are still wet and usable. And if you're following along, you might need to remix some of your original mixtures if you're not using a stay wet palette. I've decided to work on the river first. I wanted to make the river a bit greener, so I added a bit of yellow to pull the mix towards green, plus some white to make the value lighter. I lay down my brush strokes in the direction of the river flow, making sure to leave plenty of dark underlayer showing through, and of course some of the red, particularly around the rocks. I realized I needed more paint mixed, and I'm nearly out of blue, so I add more ultramarine blue to my palette and mix more of the river color. Then I lay down more brush strokes. I add more white to the mix and start lightening the water around the rocks, where the water is more turbulent. I do this a few more times, going back and forth, layering on lighter and lighter colors. I add a bit of lighter values along the side of the river and a few spots towards the middle too. I focus on the rocks again, lightening the value I'd previously mixed, but adding a bit of blue to make it grayer. Again, just a quick stroke of paint on each of the rocks, making sure to leave some of the dark layer showing underneath. I go lighter again, making sure the rocks look like they're reflecting sunlight off the top. I decide that the bottom of my rocks aren't dark enough, so I remix the dark brown color and just touch it in where the rocks would be darkest. Back to the trees, I mix a medium green using blue and yellow, leaning it a bit towards yellow because I'm adding it where the trees would be catching sunlight. Add a bit of this mix to the further trees on the left as well. Now I've decided that I don't love how the trees in the distance are looking, so I decide to make them look a little bit more like an extension of the trees on the left. I remix a darker green, adding a bit of red to neutralize and paint that on. I also think that I want some very dark darks in the trees, so now I mix a very dark purple and add a few brush strokes to the shadows in the near trees and a bit in the farther trees too. I mix a bit more medium green and touch that on, then add a bit more yellow to lighten the value and make it warmer. I take a bit of the sky color and add it to the green for the distant trees because they would be a bit blue due to their distance away. And then I changed my mind because the value was just a bit too light too quickly, so I bring a bit more of the darker color back in. I go back and forth a bit on this until I'm okay with those trees. Now I want to get a bit more serious about adding light to the trees on the right, so I add more yellow and a touch of red to the green mix to neutralize it and add it to the light areas on the trees. I add a bit of this mix to the trees on the left as well, adding a bit of my earlier green mix so it's not quite as yellow and vibrant. That's enough for the trees for now, so I add a bit of white to the gray I'd mixed for the mountain and carve in some lighter areas on the mountains. I make sure to have my brush strokes follow the direction of the shapes on the mountain. And then I feel like the mountain could use a bit of a darker gray, so I mix another dark gray, touch it in a few spots. Then I lighten that mix, add it to the lightest values on my mountain. Now back to the trees again, I add a bit more yellow to the green mix I have on my palette and touch in a few more quick, confident brush strokes. I think the water could use a bit more of a dark blue around the rocks to emphasize the light values of the foamy waters. So I mix up a quick dark green blue and just touch in the dark value in spots around the rocks and just below where there's lighter values throughout the river. Now I take white and add just a touch of my river color and add that to where I want the brightest colors in the river. I add a bit more of the river color again and add that in a few places too. Then I realize I need to make sure it looks like the river flows around the corner behind the trees, so I touch in some paint right in front of the furthest trees. You can do this exercise with many different trios or triads of color. When you're choosing a triad, use tubes of paint that are about equidistant on the color wheel from each other. You're not limited to the primaries, but that's the best place to start. In this case, I'm using what I consider the classic primaries. Other people consider different colors to be the classic primaries, and I'll explore some different color combinations in future posts. When doing a triad color painting, I recommend using one of your three colors as the dominant color, One is the supporting color and one is the subordinate. Now that this painting is nearly done, you might be able to see that the main color in the painting is blue. You might wonder, where's the blue? Because it's all green. But it's one of the original colors on your palette, and the vast majority of the greens in the painting are blue leaning. Yellow is the supporting color because I have several greens, and several of those greens are heavily yellow leaning. And red is the subordinate. I've only used it as the ground and to neutralize some of the greens. And as a ground, it really pops against all the greens in the painting. So that's it. You can paint a wonderful painting using just 3 colors. And this is a really great exercise to do because it helps make color theory real. It's one thing to do practice mixes. It's another thing to just see what you can create using these 3 colors. And it's also really handy to practice using a really minimal palette. So that is handy if you maybe want to save money. You want to buy specific tubes of paint. You want to get to the point where you use certain colors and that's what you use. It's also really handy if you're going out painting outside. You're not hauling along a dozen tubes of paint, 20 tubes of paint. I've taken courses where the instructor calls for 25 tubes of paint. So this really helps you cut down on those sorts of costs. It also helps you to really get to know certain colors and how they mix with other colors. So that's all really handy. Now, if you like this video, want to learn more about color theory, how to mix colors, how color mixing becomes real in a painting like this, just subscribe to my channel and I'll be exploring plenty more topics in future videos.